Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Noire Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing They Can't Kill Us All. They Can't Kill Us All by Wesley Lowery is a relatively recently published book detailing the incidents of police shootings and, really white vigilante shootings of Black people in America, many of whom were unarmed. The book charts both the author's experience as a relatively new journalist and also the rise of the movement in response to the killings of unarmed Black people. Lowery is a journalist who grew up in a rather diverse area, a diverse neighborhood in Cleveland, Ohio, coming from a family where his father was Black, his mother is white, very diverse neighborhood. Went to college, kind of had like the typical life to some degree, as did several of the subjects of the book, with the difference being that Lowery decided to go to school to study journalism. And through that, while living in Boston after college, his attention was drawn to the killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, a town just outside of St. Louis. Being early in his career and being a Black journalist, he was looking for a way to kind of propel his career forward, opportunities to stand out and make a name for himself. And one of the ways in which he did that, sort of not really appreciating or knowing the term, but that it would take his career down a different path, right, when he began covering the Mike Brown story. And this was after having worked in Boston, then later moving to DC, working different beats and things like that, but looking for an opportunity to do good journalism, make a name for himself, raise his profile. And so he actually became one of the first and then like one of the most prominent national journalists on the ground in Ferguson, Missouri. You get some discussion of Mike Brown incident, right, in which he was shot and killed by a police officer. Due to the police officer thinking that he was the person who had just robbed a convenience store. Or rather, items had been stolen from the convenience store. And so as it played out in 2014, I think many of us, maybe not directly in the moments afterwards, but in the days to come, saw the photos of Mike Brown's body laying out in the street for several hours. And so with that, the conversation then began to swirl, and this would turn into a major news story. But unfortunately, while that seemed to be the catalyst or one of the catalytic incidents, it wasn't the only such shooting. As in years prior, you had the beating of Rodney King in LA. You had situations with Abner Louima and Amadou Diallo in New York in the late 90s, early 2000s. And every now and then you would have these incidents popping up of people being killed by police officers, especially when they were unarmed. Situations it seemed as though they could have and likely should have been resolved otherwise, but instead ending with the death of an individual at the hands of the police, and in some instances at the hands of private citizens or, vigilantes. So what's discussed here is these individual incidents. A good amount of the book is spent discussing the progression of the Mike Brown incident as far as the circumstances, the moments leading up to Mike Brown's death, and also the reality that he'd been in the store and, what would we found out later is that allegedly he'd been in the store, had taken some items without paying for them. Sounds like he assaulted one of the workers, which is definitely wrong, right? No one's denying that. And it was him and he had like a friend with him. And so with that, they were accused of playing a part in the robbery of this store. They were confronted by a police officer shortly after leaving the store while they were walking in their neighborhood. And the situation from there, it's a little bit unclear exactly what took place, but basically what's agreed upon is that the officer ended up shooting and killing Mike Brown. From there, you then have this gathering of individuals from the community, kind of like when things happen, people gather to look on to see what's going on. And so as with many of these incidents, in the initial moments, the factual details of what took place can sometimes be unclear. And unfortunately, people, instead of waiting for the facts to come out or waiting to see what happens, they make assumptions, right? That's the reality of what took place on both sides. The people that immediately rush to judgment of the person that's been killed, making assumptions about them, their character, automatically believing that the police officer was in the right, that the shooting was justified. But at the same time, you also have this taking place sometimes on the other side, where people jump to conclusions about what took place, automatically making judgments as to whether or not the shooting was justified. Assuming that some injustice had taken place due to this individual being killed, who's right or wrong really depends on the specific situation. It can lead to flared tempers, and quite often these situations can escalate. Kind of taking a turn garnering national attention is either, when this circumstances are especially egregious, or when there's a lack of transparency about what took place, and what actions are going to happen afterwards. Is there going to be any kind of disciplinary action? Was the shooting justified, unjustified? Those are the questions people tend to have. And so with that, here you have this discussion of Mike Brown, conversations with his family and whatnot. But I think by this point, we've kind of all over the years gotten some insight, especially with the rise of cell phones, people carrying cameras, social media, which enables people to capture, if not these incidents themselves, then the moments immediately after, right? The response of the individuals. So you get more of that. The media still covers these topics, but you also get an unfiltered perspective from regular people who are now able to use their cell phones to record and share what's going on, like the images at the scene. It has its positive and negatives, that in the moments immediately following these situations, sometimes the information that's shared can be biased or it can be slanted, not necessarily with the intent of being deceptive or manipulative, but rather just in the sense of, because of the immediacy and people having their own personal beliefs and opinions, you can sometimes have information go out that is incomplete, or is somewhat inaccurate, or it's out of context. And given how quickly information can spread, that's something that has to be taken into consideration. The way that the media works, the way that social media works, is that information is put out there, and you sometimes don't really know when things are going to catch on, when things are going to spread and become a bigger story. So sometimes those initial moments when information is incomplete, you can end up having a story be put out there with some inaccuracies or lacking context and nuance, and the story spreads in that original inaccurate form. And as additional information comes out later, which would, kind of change the perspective or given a different context or perspective on what took place, it can be too late. Especially because media and social media as well tend to move in cycles. It tends to be a focus on whatever the hot story or topic of conversation is right now. And then when something else hot comes along, attention shifts. And these kinds of incidents, these stories can play out over hours, sure, but days, months, even years. So getting an understanding of what truly took place, the news cycle could move on, right? Social media could move on, or the media can just grab the story, run with it without giving it a chance to get truly relevant and accurate information, right? And so that inaccurate information becomes public knowledge. And so there's a few instances of that happening here. But mostly overall, you gain an understanding of, at this point, we understand from the victim and the police perspective, but where the book shines and the difference that it has here is sort of telling the story of what takes place in the aftermath, especially with regards to media. So like from journalists and activists on the ground, also the family members of individuals who have been killed, and also to some degree, like the police officers, right? Sort of the more supporting cast that becomes a part of, for lack of a better term, these dramatic incidents after the fact. It's a really good book, right, for individuals that think they might want to go into journalism. The reason being that you gain an understanding of not just these various situations that took place, but also how the media goes about covering such situations, how journalists go about getting information and putting together these stories, how they can be influenced as part of that as well. That you kind of get some coverage and explanation of some of the journalists that either had a relationship with Lowery or he became familiar with while covering these stories. It's like you get a lot of mini biographies along the way. And it provides a recounting and explanation as well of these various shootings, but it also sort of serves as like a memoir of the author's background, but also his coming of age in the journalism world, right? The things that influenced him, the experiences he had along the way to becoming a journalist, and then also what his experiences were like covering these various stories, how he first found out about them, how he gathered information, the people that he came into contact with, how he wrote the stories, what the inspirations were, sort of like the editorial guidelines. And so from that perspective, I think this is actually a really good book for anyone interested in journalism, but also in writing. In addition to that, the book, because in telling these stories of various shootings of Black people who are often unarmed, there's also this story of the movement that came about as a result of not just like the Black Lives Matter movement or the Black Lives Matter organization, but this broader movement of trying to accomplish police reform, trying to implement new guidelines regarding how the police interact with communities, regarding the handling of suspects, arrests, things of that nature. So one of the things that's pointed out is that in recent times, I think the term Black Lives Matter has come to be kind of a catch-all phrase, where it describes both the movement and response to these shootings and killings of Black people, these like unjustified shootings, but also the organization of Black Lives Matter. And so because they played a role in the response to these incidents, the Black Lives Matter movement has probably become one of the most prominent, if not the most prominent organization to come out of this recent movement. But as part of that, and I think this kind of speaks to media and its responsibility, this thing of searching for like sound bites, latching on to individuals or whoever can give a sound bite and having them become the spokesperson for a specific incident or broader movement when really no official leader has been declared. And I think that's something that's happened in recent years with this movement, where the Lowery actually touches on it, where the movement and the organization of Black Lives Matter have become conflated, where some of it's probably people being deliberately obtuse, but some of it's also a result of lazy journalism, where you haven't discussing the Black Lives Matter movement because some of the, let's say, prominent activists and personalities, influencers were affiliated with the Black Lives Matter organization. It's kind of skewed things a bit, where the views, opinions, actions of the individuals either involved with the Black Lives Matter organization, especially the founders, you then have it where their opinions and actions have been conflated with this larger movement. And the reality is that you have people involved in this current movement who really don't have anything to do with the organization. It's kind of this thing of, in the years since the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, I think because people are looking for ways to categorize, kind of go with what they already know, rather than creating new categories, definitions, things along those lines. And so because in the past, during the civil rights movement, you had these very prominent leaders, you had these skewed representations of who was in control, who was leading, who was organizing, the media can often rush to try to identify a leader, a spokesperson, rather than recognizing that an individual speaking or voicing their opinion is just an individual. And sure, other people might share their views and opinions and whatnot, but that one person doesn't speak for everyone else in the group. And this is something that I find tends to happen with regards to things concerning Black people and the Black community. Sure, we might share some criteria. We might all be of Black descent, but that doesn't mean that we all have the same views, opinions, because we haven't had the same experiences. But yet still, there's quite often this thing of taking the experiences or taking the perspective of one Black person and attempting to apply it to all others, a large swath of Black people. It's this thing of treating Black people, the Black diaspora, as though it's a monolith. Sure, we have this shared past identity. We have this shared part of our current identity. But that doesn't mean that we're all the same. That doesn't mean that we all have the same views and opinions. So quite often with media, they're looking for just quick sound bites, quotes, and things like that. Instead of getting out there and speaking to the many, you find this thing of them speaking to the few. And so as part of that, you end up having this thing of particular activists rising to prominence or becoming influencers, because I think it's easier for media, politicians, organizations to have to talk to and deal with maybe just a handful of people rather than trying to deal with the entire Black community or trying to talk to and get the perspective from the entire Black community. Media, politicians, pundits and whatnot, reaching out for people to give some perspective, to give sound bites, to have conversations and discussions. Once a person has been identified, quite often that'll be the person that other outlets will go to, other organizations will go to for perspective and for insight. So with that, you have where quite often these people didn't seek out they didn't set out to be spokespeople or influencers. Granted, I think some of them kind of pushed their way into the limelight, searching for attention. But I think that quite often when you're just an activist on the ground, sometimes you happen to give one interviewer a quote, you give a journalist a quote. And then here's another journalist asking for questions. And it's like, well, now you've had these conversations with these two journalists. Now you might have some politician or something that wants to have a photo op, a conversation or something along those lines. You might then have organizations now reaching out to you where there was no intention on your part to become a spokesperson or to be put into this position. Yet here you find yourself in this situation. This is something that I notice with like broader society, right? With media. When a topic comes about or there's a hot conversation taking place, media tends to go back to the same sources, to the same individuals time and time again to get insight. And so it's like you think about it during the election cycles. You'll have pretty much the same pundits, the same campaign spokespeople that the media go and speak to, go and interview. You'll have interviews from different media outlets with the same individual. So it's something that you see happening here as well, where within this movement, this social justice movement, where media organizations and whoever else, instead of looking to get a broad perspective on what's going on, to get a decent sampling, you find this thing of them going back to the same few people over and over again, which then raises their profile, gives them influence. It bestows upon them a certain degree of authority that quite often no one really chose to give to them. No one from within the community gave to them. I'm not saying that there's necessarily anything wrong with that. It's just important to understand how that comes about. And so in the midst of this, what you have occurring is that some members of the Black Lives Matter organization or other organizations where, especially due to their being social media savvy and then media savvy, they use their connections and things like that and end up moving into the limelight. And so with that, this is like how you have individuals like D-Ray and Sean King, the ladies who founded and the Black Lives Matter hashtag and the organization, where they rose in prominence and sort of became the unelected spokespeople for the movement. Although none of them, there was no official conversation in which Black people decided to make them the spokespeople for Black America, but rather this is just a thing that happens with media. What you have is you then get like a brief biography of these different individuals as far as like what their background is, what they were doing in the years prior, how they became involved with this movement, which I thought was actually pretty insightful. I don't have anything against, Black Lives Matter, D-Ray, Sean King, any of those people or any of the other activists. But what I more take issue with is this tendency for the media to be a bit lazy in its reporting on the Black community. This thing of falling back, having to deem specific individuals as like the voice or the leaders of Black America, when Black America hasn't elected any of them to these positions. This thing of rather than going and getting broad and diverse perspectives and insights, just going back to the same sources over and over again, which then kind of leads to this entrenched idea that we all believe the same things, that we're all the same people. This representative thing where it's like you take one individual and instead of recognizing them as such, the media can sometimes then take that individual and sort of turn them into the spokespeople for Black America. And so in recent years, I think you have a new crop of activists and, for lack of a better term, media personalities. Like in the years past, you also had these types of individuals in the form of like, let's say your Al Sharptons, your Jesse Jacksons, where it's like this lazy journalistic thing of needing a soundbite. So they just go to this one, Black person anytime anything happens. With media outlets, I think it's a matter of being lazy and not taking the time to do their due diligence to get out there and get diverse perspectives. And so as part of that, prior to the arrival of some of these individuals who would become influencers in this modern movement, you actually had local activists who were on the ground in these various communities, who had been working for years in some situations, trying to bring about police reform, to address social justice issues and whatnot within their local communities. And what ends up happening is when the national media glare or even local media begins to give attention to these influencers, they can sometimes gloss over the long-term work that's been in progress, the individuals who've been boots on the ground from day one, and even earlier than that, the people who for years and really generations had been doing work. Instead, what you have is that these select individuals are kind of propped up as being figureheads or leaders, and not just leaders, but the leaders of these movements, which kind of skews who's doing what's taking place. It's something that you saw as well during the civil rights movement. Well, sure, not to take anything away from like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, or any of these other individuals, but it's like prior to them, you had many other people who were active, and trying to make change, right? Organizations that were active. But because the media tends to go towards whoever's going to give the best soundbite or whoever's hot at the moment, that's where they tend to focus. So with that, there's a conversation to be had about why do certain situations get attention while others don't? Why are some people who were killed in these incidents regarded as being victims, innocent, versus those who, for lack of a better term, are deemed as like somehow deserving of their death? It's just like various topical conversations and whatnot that the book touches on. It's not a very long read. I listened to the audiobook and it's just about like 8 hours or so. Sometimes with these kinds of topics, the books can be pretty dry, but because the book discusses the broad topic of police-involved shootings and vigilante shootings of unarmed Black people, you could run the risk of it being very academic, dry, boring. But because the author in part tells his story and then also touches on the story of, not just the victims, but kind of diving more deeply into their lives so that you get away from this thing of the entirety of their lives being this one moment, their death. You get a more complete picture and understanding of them, right? Both the good and the bad. So rather than it just being this limited focus of the last moment of their lives, you get a more complete understanding of these individuals as far as who they were. There's conversation with their family members. And outside of that, you also have, like I said, these mini biographies of the various activists that have been involved with the movement. You get some insight into kind of taking a step back from the individual activists, the influencers, to talk to the local people who remained after the cameras left. You get an understanding of the organizations that are doing work, the ones that had been pre-existent and had been trying to address these various issues. But then you also have sort of an overview of the newer organizations that came about directly as a result of these incidents, basically growing out of these individual local incidents. So in reading this book, I didn't really have any expectations, right? I read the blurb and it sounded pretty interesting, but in reading the book, I was actually quite impressed with it. At first I was a little bit apprehensive when I first started listening to the book. The author was talking about his life, his experience as a journalist, because not that I have a problem reading about a journalist or anything like that, but it really wasn't what I was expecting. So I think that was maybe just like the prologue or something like that, right? But what I quickly came to realize is that the author this wasn't going to be like a memoir, but rather it's more discussing these various incidents that occurred, but sort of giving context as far as I think we kind of all do this thing of where were you or what were you doing when you first heard about X situation? So the author gives some perspective by explaining where he was and what he was doing when these incidents occurred. But the focus of the book remains on the individuals that lost their lives, the incidents surrounding the circumstances, the situations leading up to their deaths and the aftermath. And so with that, you have how the broader movement came about. And so it's not the author just giving you a book about himself. He's in the book, but does make the book about him. The focus of the book remains on the subject at hand, which is these killings of Black people. And with that, I actually really liked the approach. I felt that talking about this broader situation, social justice issue, could have resulted in a very dry book if it was very academic and just focused on the data. But I think what makes the book insightful and really draws you in is the stories of the people. So certainly there's information about data and statistics, things like that, law and policy, but the book still feels very human. The subjects feel very humanized because it's told through the lives and experiences of individuals rather than it just being about numbers and stats. And I think that was a really smart decision on Lowery's part because it elicits more of an emotional response because it's not just facts and figures. It's very much a book about people, about human beings. And I think by approaching the book in this way, it gives you some perspective on the individuals involved but also allows you to kind of put yourself in their shoes. And so with that, I actually think this is a great book. It's a relatively quick read. It touches on some pretty heavy topics, but does so in a manner that I think is very approachable. And so with that, I highly recommend this book. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noire Histoire website via the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more book recommendations, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my book review playlist.